Hello class, I hope everyone's doing well during this quarantine period. It's unfortunate we can't do presentations in class, but that being said, I was assigned the Boys and Girls episode using the neo-Marxist perspective. So first and foremost, I'd like to give a definition of the perspective, and it is as follows. Helps expose how material conditions and economic practices shape dominant ideology regarding taken for granted assumptions about who ought to be and who not to be empowered. So in other words, this is an us versus them mentality. So when writing out this perspective, I really looked at two main competing groups. The first one was the women in the office and the male workers of the office. That including the men from the warehouse and the men from the upper part of the main building of the office. And a question I'd like to ask everyone about this presentation is who do you think was more successful? Who do you think was more successful in this, in their attempt to use this perspective? And lastly, explain why you think which group was successful. So the first group I looked at was the women of the office. And for my research, I focused on the role women play in the corporate workforce. So in regards to this episode, this plays out at the start of the episode when Jan leads a roundtable discussion amongst all the women about the skills they offer at Dunder Mifflin and in the corporate world in general. And what I found about this, what I really got out of this, and where I think the neo-Marxist perspective plays out, is the motivation of the women for the office is empowerment. What skills can they offer at the company, and how those translate. So that being said, a major form of this perspective is hegemony, and the definition is as follows. Simply put, hegemony is the privileging of a dominance group ideology over that of all groups. So in other words, the women in the office feel that the culture at Dunder Mifflin is very much patriarchal in nature, and this meeting really emphasizes how they feel they can beat this type of culture. However, there is very much a clear disagreement about what skills are valuable at the company and how they translate, and which ones should be used in general. So, and really when it comes down to it, the research I found was based on labor. According to this theory, this really relates to Marxism, is the value of work. Each member of the office feels their value is more superior than that of others, which leads to disagreement. So therefore, each of them have a different view of what it takes to be. But ultimately, I felt when looking at the role of women in the office that I felt that their strategy was best used by Jan when she uses her power to pretty much tell the workers of the warehouse that if you guys unionize, you're going to lose money and you can lose jobs. The second group that I analyzed, the competing group I looked at that used this perspective, was the male workers of the office. And in essence, really the main purpose of how the men really come together is after James says that they're going to form a group of women discussing women's roles in the office and empowering them. Michael then goes down to the warehouse with all the other male workers, and they go on a rant about how the men don't have much power. But ultimately, the real goal here is of the warehouse workers is to unionize, to have a bigger seat at the table when it comes to decision making. And ultimately, when I was doing my research, it became very clear here that the union workers here ultimately fail in their goal for more power. And really, the way they gain more power was by taking advantage of Michael in this situation. Really talking about how Jan gets on his nerves. So in essence, he's playing into this neo-Marxist perspective that somehow he deserves more power. He deserves more power, and because he's a male, because all the other workers, male workers, the warehouse workers are making that same argument. So in essence, he's trying to fit into what they believe in, to adopt this us versus them mentality. However, when it comes down to it, in my view, the warehouse workers fail to become the dominant group because they don't take into account the authority Jan really has at Dunder Mifflin. Because after all, she's very much up there with the head CEO of the company. So that being said, the last part of the neo-Marxist perspective is talking about the implications, the implications of a specific artifact and how it impacts society. So my first implication I talked about was never underestimate the authority you're trying to gain power over. And in essence, really, we see this with warehouse workers failing to understand the power that Jan has at corporate. And in my research, one of the downsides I found of unions was that I found of when trying to gain control or power in society or at any organization is the lack of understanding. One of my authors said the following: "It's a lack of understanding of our culture that often can be the biggest barrier. It can also be the barrier which people don't see the easiest. Being exposed to a culture that is subject to rules." So clearly, Michael himself doesn't even understand the role of corporate here. And really, when it comes down to it, getting more power and control requires you to know what group you want to be more dominant over. And in this case, both the male warehouse workers and Michael's quest to sort of boost his ego by feeding into what the warehouse workers are saying, really, that's why it ultimately fails. Then, my last implication of when using this perspective based on this episode of The Office is that power is not determined by gender. So clearly, the warehouse workers in this situation thought that because they're men, because they perceived Michael's position as very high as being the branch manager of the Scranton branch, that he has a lot of power. But they fail to recognize that Jan is more powerful. She has a more powerful seat at corporate. So this really goes to show that, as I said before, it goes to show that power is not determined by gender. It's all about your position. It's all about knowing where their current position lies, and that's where I feel in society, and that's what I wrote about my paper, is in order to dictate rules, dictate and create your own culture, you yourself have to have power. So by them making the assumption because they're men and they can use Michael to their advantage, it simply does not work. So that being said, in conclusion, I wrote my paper about the neo-Marxist perspective, and the two main competing groups were the men of the warehouse and the the employees from the upper floor of the office, and the women workers. So if you have any questions about my presentation, you go to the discussion board, write comments down what you thought, and more importantly, who you felt was more successful in using this perspective.